In the depth of night, when the world loses its noise and every distraction falls away, there is a moment the heart begins to recognize but cannot fully explain. This is the time of Tahajjud, not as an action of the body, but as a turning of the inner self toward something beyond form. At this hour, silence is not empty. It carries a hidden weight, as if unseen realities are closer than they are in the daylight. Ibni Arabi, toward a truth hidden from ordinary awareness, that in these sacred hours, the soul is not only calling, it is being shaped in return. This is where effort softens, control fades, and something deeper begins to unfold without sound or witness. The hidden light of Tahajjud is not seen with the eyes, it is felt as an inward shift, where confusion becomes clarity and distance turns into nearness. And in that stillness, destiny itself is touched in ways the mind cannot measure, but the heart quietly understands. When the night opens a door that daytime closes, there are moments in creation when the usual order of things begins to soften, as if the world itself steps aside to reveal something that was always present but never noticed. Ibni Arabi ishara toward realities that are not bound by what the eyes see or what the mind quickly understands, but by what the heart becomes capable of receiving when everything else grows quiet. The night is not only a passage of time, it is a shift in the inner atmosphere of existence. During the day, perception is crowded, shaped by movement, demands, identities, and endless interpretations of what life appears to be. But when night settles, that outward pressure begins to withdraw, and something subtle becomes available to the inward traveler. It is as though a door, long hidden behind the noise of living, gently becomes visible without announcing itself. This door is not physical. It is a threshold of awareness, a transition point where the human being is no longer pulled outward by constant engagement, but is instead invited inward toward a quieter layer of understanding. Ibni Arabi often spoke in symbols because direct language cannot carry what is experienced in states beyond ordinary perception. In this sense, the opening of night is not an event happening outside the soul, it is a rearrangement within it. When daytime closes its influence, it does not disappear as something meaningless. Rather, it completes its function and steps back. What remains is a space that feels less occupied, less defined by expectation. In that space, the heart begins to notice itself differently, not as a reacting entity, but as something capable of listening without interruption. This is where the door becomes meaningful. It represents the point at which the outward-facing self loses its dominance. Thoughts that once felt urgent begin to lose their sharpness. Concerns that appeared solid start to feel less absolute. Even the sense of personal control, which usually shapes perception, becomes less rigid. In this softening, a new kind of attention is born, one that does not rush to interpret, but quietly observes. Ibni Arabi's language suggests that reality has layers, and not all layers are accessible at the same time. The daytime self moves within a visible layer where causes and effects seem clear and immediate. But the night reveals a different layer, one where meaning is not forced into explanation, but gradually uncovered through stillness. It is not that something new is created at night, rather something concealed becomes less hidden. The opening of this door is subtle. It does not announce itself with dramatic signs. It is recognized only by those moments when the heart feels slightly detached from its usual weight. A sense arises that existence is broader than what has been previously assumed, and that personal experience is only one small expression within a much larger unfolding. Even silence begins to carry depth, not silence as absence of sound, but silence as presence without interruption. Within it, the soul is no longer fully occupied with defining everything it encounters. Instead, it begins to sense that not everything requires definition. Some things are meant to be approached through awareness rather than analysis. Ibni Arabi would describe such moments not as escape from reality, but as entry into a more refined perception of it. The door that night opens is not leading away from life, but toward a layer of life that is usually overlooked when attention is divided and scattered. It is a return, not outward but inward, to a state where the soul is less fragmented and more gathered. And so when the night opens a door that daytime closes, it is not about separation between two worlds, but about the shifting of attention from one mode of seeing to another, one that is louder and one that is quieter, one that reacts and one that receives. And in that receiving, something begins to quietly reorganize itself within the human experience, without force, without noise, and without needing to be fully understood to be real. The disappearance of inner noise. There is a kind of noise that does not come from the world outside, but from within the human being himself. It is not always loud in sound, yet it is constant in presence. It moves through thoughts, memories, expectations, unfinished emotions, and silent conversations that continue even when the tongue is still. Ibn Arabi would point toward this inner movement not as a flaw, but as a layer of human awareness that usually goes unnoticed because it has become familiar. During the daytime of life, this inner noise blends with activity so naturally that it feels like part of normal existence. The mind keeps interpreting, comparing, remembering, preparing. Even when a person is not speaking, something within remains active, measuring outcomes, revisiting moments, anticipating what has not yet come. Over time, this becomes so continuous that silence feels almost unnatural. But in certain moments, especially when the outer world begins to withdraw, something changes in this inner structure. It is not forced, and it is not achieved through struggle. It happens like a gradual loosening, as if the threads that hold constant mental motion begin to relax without resistance. Ibn Arabi's way of describing inward states often suggests that transformation is not always an act of addition, but sometimes an act of quiet removal. The disappearance of inner noise is not the destruction of thought. Thoughts still arise, but they lose their authority. They no longer occupy the entire space of awareness. They begin to feel less like commands and more like passing forms across a still background. This shift is subtle but profound because it changes the relationship between the self and its own mind. Human beings may not even recognize this change. It is only noticed in contrast, in the brief realization that something which usually feels heavy has become lighter, or something that usually demands attention has become less urgent. In that moment, awareness is no longer fully entangled in its own movements. Ibn Arabi ishara toward the idea that the heart has its own clarity, but it is often covered by layers of internal activity. When these layers become quieter, not through suppression but through natural settling, the heart begins to perceive differently. It is not that new information arrives, but that existing perception becomes less distorted by continuous interpretation. Even the idea of self-talk begins to fade. The inner voice does not disappear completely, but it stops dominating the field of awareness. It becomes less like a narrator and more like a distant echo that no longer demands response. This creates a kind of spaciousness within the being, a space that was always present but rarely experienced. This spaciousness is not empty in a negative sense. It is not a void that feels lacking. It is a field of quiet presence where awareness no longer feels divided into many directions at once. Instead of being pulled between countless internal signals, attention begins to gather itself naturally without effort. Such moments are not merely psychological calmness. They are signs that perception is becoming less constrained by habitual patterns of interpretation. The inner noise, which once acted like a filter over experience, begins to loosen its grip, and as it loosens, reality is no longer as heavily shaped by constant commentary. This does not mean that life becomes absent of thought or reflection. Rather, thought returns to its rightful place, as a tool, not a ruler. It arises when needed and fades when not required, without occupying the entire field of awareness. The disappearance of inner noise also reveals something subtle, the presence of a deeper stillness that was never absent. It was simply overlooked, like a background that was always there but never noticed. because attention was focused on movement in front of it. When the movement slows, the background becomes visible for the first time. And in this recognition, a quiet understanding begins to form that the human being is not only what he thinks and not only what he hears within himself. There is something deeper, something less reactive, something that remains even when internal activity becomes silent. Ibn Arabi would not describe this as escape from thought, but as returning thought to its proper scale. The inner noise does not need to be fought. It only needs to be seen clearly enough that it no longer defines the entire horizon of experience. And when that happens, the human being begins to notice a different kind of presence, one that was always there, waiting beneath the sound of his own mind. When the heart enters a state of unknown stillness, there is a form of stillness that cannot be learned through instruction, nor reached through deliberate effort. It arrives without announcement, and it cannot be fully described once it appears. Ibn Arabi would suggest that such states are not created by the seeker, but revealed to the seeker when inner conditions quietly align beyond his awareness. This stillness is not the absence of movement in the ordinary sense. The world does not stop, and thoughts may still pass through the mind. Yet something deeper changes in the way all of this is experienced. It is as if the center from which everything is perceived has shifted into a quieter dimension, where reactions no longer form immediately around what is happening. The heart may not recognize what is taking place. It does not feel like achievement, and it does not feel like arrival in the usual sense of accomplishment. Instead, it feels unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, but unclassified. The human being cannot easily label it, because it does not belong to any familiar emotional category. It is neither excitement nor sadness, neither fullness nor emptiness. It simply is. Ibn Arabi's language often points towards states that exist beyond dualities, where opposites no longer define experience in the same way. In this unknown stillness, the heart is no longer fully shaped by contrast. It is not constantly comparing what is with what should be. The inner tendency to measure reality against expectation begins to weaken, and in that weakening, perception becomes less divided. This stillness can feel like standing at the edge of something vast, without needing to step forward or step back. There is no urgency within it, no internal demand to explain, correct, or adjust what is being experienced. The heart remains present, but without the pressure of interpretation. It is important to understand that this is not a state of emptiness in the sense of loss. It is more like a suspension of inner noise and inner resistance at the same time. The usual movement of emotional response slows down, not because it has been suppressed, but because it is no longer being triggered in the same way. Awareness begins to take a different shape. Instead of moving outward to immediately define what it encounters, it remains closer to its source. There is a sense of inward grounding, as if attention has returned to a quieter point within the self that does not react as quickly as before. Ibn Arabi might describe this as a moment where the heart begins to witness without rushing to interpret. Witnessing here is not passive observation, but a refined form of presence where experience is allowed to appear without being immediately shaped into meaning. Meaning is not absent, but it is not forced either. It unfolds at its own pace. This unknown stillness also reveals something subtle about the nature of inner certainty. It is not loud, and it does not arrive with strong emotional intensity. Instead, it feels like stability without explanation, a kind of inner steadiness that does not depend on external validation or internal agreement. Even time begins to feel less rigid. The passing of moments is still there, but the heart is less bound by them. There is no rush toward what comes next, and no attachment to what has just passed. The present moment becomes less of a point between two extremes, and more of a continuous field in which awareness rests. It is in this condition that the phrase unknown stillness becomes meaningful. It is unknown not because it is chaotic or unclear, but because it does not belong to the categories through which the mind usually organizes experience. It cannot be fully explained in familiar terms, and yet it is not confusing to the one who experiences it, that such stillness is not an end, but a refinement of perception. It is a moment where the heart is gently separated from unnecessary inner movement, allowing it to sense reality without distortion, not by becoming something else, but by becoming less divided within itself. Something subtle begins to emerge, a recognition that stillness is not a lack of experience, but a different quality of experience altogether, one that does not demand interpretation to be real, and does not require noise to confirm its presence. The moment control loses its shape, where something very familiar begins to loosen its structure within the human being, the sense of control. Not control in the physical sense of actions or decisions alone, but the deeper psychological need to shape outcomes, to predict outcomes, and to hold life within the boundaries of understanding. Ibn Arabi would describe such moments not as collapse, but as unveiling, where what was once firm begins to reveal its fluid nature. Control is often experienced as stability. It gives the mind a sense of direction, and it allows the self to feel anchored in uncertainty. Throughout daily life, this structure quietly operates in the background, choosing responses, preparing outcomes, imagining consequences, and organizing reality into something manageable. Without noticing it, the human being becomes accustomed to the feeling that life must be held in order to remain safe. But in certain inward states, especially those shaped by deep stillness and reduced inner noise, this structure begins to soften. It does not break suddenly. It begins to lose its rigidity, as if its edges are no longer as fixed as they once appeared. What was once experienced as solid certainty starts to feel more like a shifting form. This is not a loss in the sense of damage. It is a transformation in perception. The need to control does not vanish entirely, but it stops dominating the field of awareness. The human being begins to notice that much of what he tried to hold was never fully in his grasp to begin with, and this realization does not arrive as an intellectual conclusion. It arrives as lived experience. Ibn Arabi's way of pointing toward inner realities often reveals that what we call control is actually a relationship with uncertainty. The mind tries to reduce uncertainty by creating structure around it. But when perception deepens, the human being begins to sense that uncertainty was never something to be eliminated. It was part of the unfolding itself. The shape of control begins to dissolve. The word shape is important here because control is not a single thing. It is a form that the mind repeatedly constructs. It is the pattern of holding, resisting, adjusting, and directing. When this pattern weakens, life is no longer experienced as something that must constantly be managed at every level. This can feel unfamiliar. The inner system that is used to directing outcomes begins to notice that its usual pressure is no longer producing the same intensity. Situations still arise, choices still appear, but the inner urgency to fully shape everything begins to decrease. The self still acts, but it acts with less tension. Something subtle becomes noticeable. Not everything requires intervention. Some events unfold without needing constant adjustment. Some paths develop without being forced, and some outcomes reveal themselves only when the pressure to control them is reduced. Ibn Arabi would point toward this as a shift from dominance to witnessing, where the human being begins to see life as unfolding rather than being constructed moment by moment. This does not mean passivity. It is not a withdrawal from responsibility. Instead, it is a change in the quality of engagement. Action continues, but it is no longer driven by the same inner urgency to guarantee results. There is a difference between participating in life and attempting to fully contain it. As control loses its rigid shape, the heart begins to experience a different kind of trust, not emotional optimism, but a quiet recognition that reality has its own intelligence of unfolding. This trust is not built through reasoning. It arises when the constant need to manage every detail begins to lose its necessity. Ibn Arabi's perspective suggests that this shift is part of deeper unveiling. The human being is not losing power, but losing illusion. the illusion that everything must be held tightly in order to remain coherent. When that illusion weakens, a more spacious awareness becomes available, one in which life is not always resisting, but often revealing itself. Even uncertainty begins to feel different. It is no longer perceived as a threat that must be controlled, but as an open field that does not demand immediate closure. The mind still functions, but it no longer dominates the entire horizon of experience. And so when control loses its shape, what is really happening is not disappearance, but refinement, a transformation from rigid holding into fluid participation, from forced direction into attentive presence, from trying to contain life into beginning to witness its unfolding. And in this quiet transition, the human being begins to sense that what he once called control was only one layer of experience, not the foundation of reality itself. The invisible approach of divine attention. There are moments in the inward journey where something begins to feel different, even though nothing outward has changed. The surroundings remain the same, the silence remains the same, yet the inner perception becomes slightly more sensitive, as if something subtle is drawing near, not in space, but in awareness itself. Ibn Arabi would describe such moments not as imagination, but as a refinement of perception where the heart becomes aware of realities that were always present but not previously recognized. This approach is not physical, and it is not sensory in the usual way. It cannot be located or measured, and it does not arrive with any visible sign. Instead, it is experienced as a shift in the quality of inner presence. The human being begins to feel less alone within his own awareness, not because something external has appeared, but because the field of perception itself has become more intimate. The idea of divine attention in this context does not refer to a movement from one place to another, as if something distant is now coming closer in a spatial sense. Rather, it refers to the unveiling of nearness that was never absent. Ibn Arabi often pointed toward this paradox. What the seeker believes is approaching was, in truth, never far. It is the state of the heart that changes, not the reality of nearness itself. As this invisible approach begins to be sensed, the inner atmosphere becomes more delicate. Thoughts lose some of their density, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer the only layer of awareness being experienced. There is a subtle widening, as if perception has more depth than before, allowing multiple layers of experience to coexist without conflict. The human being may notice a quiet shift in how attention feels. Attention is no longer fully owned by the self as it usually is during ordinary consciousness. It feels less like something being directed outward by personal will, and more like something being gently held within a larger field of awareness. This is not loss of individuality, but a softening of its exclusivity. Ibn Arabi's perspective would suggest that what is being called divine attention is not new attention arriving from outside existence, but the unveiling of an ever-present reality that is usually covered by distraction and inner fragmentation. When those coverings weaken even slightly, the human being begins to sense a nearness that does not depend on movement or distance. This nearness does not create dramatic emotional reactions. It is not always experienced as an overwhelming feeling. In fact, it is often quiet, almost subtle to the point of being overlooked if the heart is not attentive. Yet it carries a distinct quality, a sense that existence is no longer purely mechanical or disconnected, but is instead held within a deeper coherence that is not immediately visible. The self does not feel watched in a limiting sense, but rather accompanied in a way that cannot be explained through ordinary language. It is not surveillance nor observation in the human sense. It is more like awareness recognizing itself within awareness, without separation becoming absolute. The invisible approach also alters the way inner experience is held. Emotions may still arise, thoughts may still appear, but they no longer feel entirely isolated. There is a sense that even what is personal is not fully disconnected from a larger field of meaning. Ibn Arabi would describe this as a soft unveiling of unity within multiplicity. where differences remain, but isolation weakens. The heart begins to respond differently to life itself. Events are no longer experienced as purely external interruptions. Instead, they begin to feel like part of a continuous unfolding that includes both seen and unseen dimensions. This does not remove difficulty or confusion, but it changes the inner relationship between them. The approach in this sense is not a movement toward the human being, but a removal of what prevented recognition. As coverings decrease, what was always present becomes more perceptible. It is like light that was always shining, but only now is the dust beginning to settle enough for it to be noticed. Ibn Arabi's tone would emphasize that this is not a privilege granted to a few, but a state tied to the readiness of perception. The invisible approach is always ongoing, but it is only experienced when inner noise, control, and fragmentation lose some of their dominance. Then, what was hidden by familiarity begins to reveal itself as presence, and in this delicate recognition, something changes within the human being, not the arrival of something new, but the realization that nearness was never absent, only unseen. When perception starts to shift inward, there is a turning point in the inner journey where attention, which is usually directed outward toward events, people, and changing circumstances, begins to slowly return toward its own source. It is not a physical movement, and it is not a deliberate decision made by the mind. It happens more like a reorientation of awareness itself, a quiet shift in direction that cannot be forced. Ibn Arabi would describe this not as a new experience being created, but as perception uncovering its original orientation. Perception is constantly extended outward. It moves toward what is seen, heard, imagined, and remembered. It builds a world through continuous engagement, interpreting reality through layers of meaning and reaction. This outward flow becomes so natural that the human being rarely questions it. Life is experienced as something out there, while the inner self remains the center that reacts to it. But in certain moments of stillness, especially when inner noise begins to fade and control loses its rigidity, this outward movement begins to soften. Attention does not collapse, it turns. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it begins to gather back toward the inner field from which all experience is being witnessed. This is not withdrawal from the world. It is a change in the direction of seeing. Ibn Arabi's language often suggests that reality has both outward appearance and inward depth, and that the two are not separate worlds but different layers of the same unfolding. When perception begins to shift inward, the human being does not lose contact with the outer world, but begins to sense a deeper layer beneath it, a layer where experience is not only happening, but being witnessed from within. This inward shift may feel unfamiliar. The mind is used to reaching outward for clarity, for confirmation, for meaning. It is accustomed to finding understanding in external reference points. But as perception turns inward, those reference points begin to feel less dominant. The center of awareness starts to feel closer, quieter, and less dependent on external validation. This inward movement is subtle. It is not accompanied by dramatic sensations or visible signs. Instead, it is recognized through a change in how experience feels. Events still occur, but they begin to feel slightly less distant from the observer. There is a sense that the boundary between what is happening and the one who is aware of it is becoming less rigid. This does not mean that the world is dissolving. Rather, it means that the human being is beginning to perceive the unity underlying apparent separation. The outward world continues in its form, but awareness no longer experiences it as completely detached from its own presence. As perception turns inward, thoughts also begin to change their position within awareness. Instead of pulling attention outward into endless interpretation, they begin to appear more clearly as movements within consciousness itself. They are no longer the entire landscape of experience, but phenomena arising within a deeper field of awareness. This shift also affects the sense of identity. The self is no longer experienced only as the center that responds to external life. It begins to feel more like a witness that exists prior to reaction, not as something distant or abstract. but as a quiet presence that remains constant while everything else changes shape. Ibn Arabi would suggest that this inward turn is not separation from reality, but entry into a more foundational way of perceiving it. The human being begins to notice that awareness is not only directed toward things, it is also the space in which things appear. And when attention begins to rest closer to that space, perception becomes less fragmented. This inward shift also brings a subtle change in time. The usual sense of moving from past to future begins to soften. The present moment feels less like a passing point and more like a stable field in which experience unfolds. Memory and anticipation still exist, but they no longer fully dominate the horizon of awareness. Even ordinary experiences begin to carry a different tone. A simple thought, a quiet moment, or a passing feeling is no longer fully externalized. It is experienced closer to its origin within awareness itself. This creates a sense of intimacy with experience that does not depend on external intensity. Ibn Arabi's tone would emphasize that this is not a special state reserved for a few, but a natural possibility within human perception when it is no longer entirely outward driven. The inward shift is not an achievement, but a revealing, the uncovering of a direction that was always available but often overlooked. And in this turning inward, something becomes quietly clear. What was once thought to be far away was always being experienced from within the same field of awareness. The shift does not bring something new into existence. It changes where the human being recognizes he has always been standing. The light that does not appear but reveals. There is a form of light that does not behave like the light of the physical world. It does not enter through the eyes, and it does not take a visible shape in space. It cannot be pointed at, measured, or described as an object among other objects. Yet its effect is undeniable. It changes the way things are understood, without changing the things themselves. Ibn Arabi would point toward this as a subtle unveiling within perception, where meaning becomes clearer not through sight, but through inward recognition. Light is associated with what allows things to be seen externally. It reveals forms, colors, and boundaries, but this other light does something different. It does not illuminate objects, it illuminates understanding itself. It is not about what is seen, but about how seeing becomes possible in a deeper sense. When it is present, even familiar experiences begin to carry a different depth, as if they are being understood from a more refined level of awareness. This light does not announce itself. It does not arrive with dramatic intensity or emotional overflow. In fact, it is often so subtle that it can be mistaken for a simple moment of clarity or calmness. But what distinguishes it is its effect. Confusion loses some of its density, and what once felt scattered begins to feel quietly arranged without effort. Ibn Arabi's perspective would suggest that this kind of revealing is not external illumination, but internal disclosure. It is not that something new is added to perception, but that veils within perception become thinner. As these veils soften, understanding does not come as information, but as recognition, as if what is being understood was always known at a deeper level, but not fully accessible until this moment. The light that does not appear is called so because it does not stand in front of awareness as an object. Instead, it works within awareness itself, altering the quality of perception from within. It is like a shift in the medium through which everything is experienced. The world remains the same in form, but its meaning begins to unfold in a different way. The human being may notice that answers seem to arise without deliberate reasoning, not in the sense of sudden thoughts replacing thinking, but in the sense that understanding becomes less forced. There is a natural unfolding of clarity that does not depend on mental struggle. The mind still functions, but it is no longer the only source of recognition. This revealing light also affects the relationship between uncertainty and understanding. What once felt like confusion no longer carries the same weight. It is not immediately replaced with absolute certainty, but it becomes less threatening. There is a sense that not knowing is not absence, but a space where deeper understanding is still forming. Ibn Arabi would often emphasize that true unveiling is not about gaining new information, but about seeing with less distortion. In this sense, the light does not add something foreign to perception, it removes the heaviness that previously shaped it. What remains is not exaggerated clarity, but simplicity, a kind of understanding that does not require justification to be recognized as true. As this inner light becomes more present, even time begins to feel different in experience. Moments are no longer only sequences of events, but carriers of meaning that reveal themselves gradually. A single instant can hold a depth that was previously overlooked, not because it changed, but because perception has become more receptive. There is also a quiet shift in the sense of effort. What once required analysis or prolonged reflection may begin to settle more naturally. This does not mean thinking disappears, rather, thinking becomes lighter, less burdened by the need to resolve everything immediately. Understanding begins to feel less like construction and more like reception. This can be understood as a sign of inner refinement, where perception is no longer limited to surface interpretation, but begins to touch the underlying coherence of things. The light that reveals does not impose meaning, it allows meaning to appear in its own natural unfolding. The paradox becomes clear. This light does not appear as an object in the world, yet it changes how the entire world is seen. It does not announce itself, yet its presence becomes recognizable through the quiet transformation of understanding. It does not add a new sight, but it changes the quality of seeing itself, until even ordinary reality begins to feel slightly more transparent than before. When destiny moves without sound or disturbance, there are movements in existence that do not resemble movement as the human mind understands it. In ordinary experience, change is associated with noise, transition, interruption, and visible turning points. Something begins, something ends, and between them there is usually a moment of disturbance that marks the shift. But Ibn Arabi would point toward a deeper order of reality, where transformation does not always announce itself, and where destiny unfolds without the need for visible disruption. Destiny is not a force that suddenly pushes life in a different direction with dramatic signs. It is more like a continuous unfolding that is already in motion, only becoming noticeable when the human being's perception becomes refined enough to recognize it. What appears as sudden change is often only the surface of a process that has been quietly developing beneath awareness for a long time. When inner stillness deepens, when inner noise has softened, control has lost its rigidity, and perception has begun to turn inward, something unusual begins to be felt. Life no longer feels like a sequence of disconnected events. Instead, it begins to appear as a single unfolding movement, where each moment is connected to the next in ways that are not immediately visible but are quietly coherent. The movement of destiny is experienced not as interruption but as continuity. Things shift, yet the shift does not feel violent. Decisions arise, paths open or close, circumstances change, but the inner reaction to these changes is different. There is less resistance, not because the human being has become indifferent, but because perception has begun to recognize a deeper order beneath appearances. Ibn Arabi would suggest that what we call destiny is not separate from existence. It is the structure of unfolding itself. It is not imposed from outside, but revealed from within the flow of being. When awareness is caught in surface-level interpretation, this unfolding appears fragmented, unpredictable, and sometimes chaotic. But when awareness becomes more settled, the same unfolding begins to appear as a quiet coherence. The phrase "without sound or disturbance" becomes meaningful here. Sound and disturbance represent the way change is usually experienced through resistance. When something shifts in life, the mind reacts, emotions respond, and identity adjusts itself around the new situation. This reaction creates internal noise, but when perception is more unified, change is no longer experienced as something breaking into life. It is experienced as life revealing another of its layers. Even significant transitions may feel strangely calm. not because they are small, but because the inner field of awareness is no longer fragmented enough to amplify them into turmoil. The human being still recognizes change, but the recognition does not come with collapse or confusion. It comes with a quiet sense of acknowledgement, as if something already understood has simply taken form. Ibn Arabi's perspective would describe this as witnessing the unfolding of decree with reduced interference from the self's interpretations. The self no longer stands in constant opposition to what is happening. Instead, it begins to observe how each moment carries its own place within a larger continuity that was never truly broken. Destiny is not something chasing the human being or something being chased. It is not a force outside waiting to impose outcomes. It is the movement of reality itself, experienced more clearly when inner disturbance has lessened. The quieter the inner world becomes, the more visible this movement feels, not as spectacle, but as subtle direction. Even what appears as delay or detour begins to carry a different meaning. It is no longer immediately categorized as loss or interruption. Instead, it is seen as part of a wider arrangement that is still unfolding. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it changes the way uncertainty is held. It becomes less of a rupture and more of an open segment within a continuous design. This is not about predicting destiny or fully understanding it. It is about perceiving it without excessive resistance. The human being does not need to grasp the entire design for peace to emerge. Peace arises when the need to constantly oppose or control the unfolding begins to soften. And so, when destiny moves without sound or disturbance, it is not because nothing is happening. It is because something is happening at a level where noise is no longer produced by resistance. Movement continues, life continues, change continues, but the inner field through which all of it is experienced has become quieter, more receptive, and less divided. In that quietness, destiny is not felt as pressure or shock, but as a gentle continuity, a movement that was never separate from existence, only previously hidden beneath the noise of reaction. Remember that Tahajjud is not measured by time, but by what it awakens within the heart. It is a space where silence becomes meaningful, and where the soul learns to recognize what words cannot carry. Ibn Arabi pointed toward realities that do not appear in the noise of the day, but in the quiet surrender of the night. And in that sacred stillness, something subtle begins to change, not always in what you see, but in how you begin to feel, understand, and trust. Perhaps the real secret was never in the night itself, but in what the night reveals to the one who turns toward it sincerely. And when the heart is ready, even silence becomes a guide.